The fog didn't just sit in the alley off Bracken Street, it owned the mortgage on it. It was a cold, damp blanket that smelled of dead fish and the kind of industrial soot that sticks to your soul. Patrolman Bernie Keeler moved through it with the grace of a man walking through a vat of cold gravy, his flashlight cutting a yellow hole in the grey soup that closed up as fast as he could tear it open. The light flickered, dying a slow death in his hand, a cheap piece of city-contracted tin that had all the reliability of a politician's campaign promise. He turned the corner where the brickwork was slick with a greasy sweat. The walls felt like they were weeping a slow, tectonic despair, the kind of moisture that didn't just sit on the surface but seeped into the marrow. Under the jaundiced eye of his dying beam, the mortar looked like bad dental work in the mouth of a giant. It was a place where shadows didn't just hide, they conspired. The air was thick enough to chew, flavored with the metallic tang of the nearby docks and the sweet, rotting scent of a city that had given up on its Sunday bath decades ago. The silence here wasn't empty. It was heavy and expectant, like a loaded gun sitting on a velvet cushion. The man wasn't slumped like a drunk or sprawled like a victim of a street corner scuffle. He was lying flat on his back, centered in the narrow passage with a geometric precision that made Keeler's neck hairs stand up and salute. His toes pointed straight at the heavy sky, and his hands were folded over his stomach, as if he'd just finished a particularly satisfying Sunday dinner, and decided the pavement was as good a place as any for a nap.
Beautiful.
He stepped closer, his boots crunching on grit that sounded like breaking teeth in the silence. The flashlight beam crawled over the body. It was a suit that cost more than Keeler made in a month, charcoal wool, sharp creases, not a speck of dust on the lapels. The shoes were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the sickly yellow of the flashlight like two predatory eyes. There was no blood, no torn fabric, no sign that the world had done anything but tuck this man in for the night.
Hey, you get back from there.
Keeler swung the light. A shape resolved itself out of the gloom, a man leaning against a damp crate, clutching a coat that had seen better decades. He had a face like a crumpled paper bag and eyes that had spent too much time looking at the bottom of a glass.
I didn't do nothing.
Shortcuts in Port Gray usually lead to the morgue or the harbor, pal.
Eddie, just Eddie. I don't want no trouble, officer. I saw him, that's all. Just lying there like he was waiting for a bus that doesn't run anymore.
How long have you been standing here, Eddie?
5 minutes, maybe an hour. Time gets slippery in the fog, you know that.
Keeler looked back at the body. The face was peaceful, too peaceful. It had the vacuum-sealed serenity of a wax figure in a basement museum, the kind of expression a man wears when he's realized the joke is on him but he's too polite to stop laughing. His skin had the waxy, translucent quality of a high-priced candle, and his features were as sharp and predatory as a loan shark's ledger.
He's clean.
Maybe he didn't have anything to fight. You see anyone else? Anyone running? A shadow that didn't belong to a building?
In this.
Keeler looked at the street lamp at the end of the alley. It buzzed with a frantic electric hum, the light trapped in the moisture like a fly in amber. The whole city felt like that, trapped, waiting for a punch that hadn't landed yet.
Get out of here, Eddie.
I was never here.
Keeler stood alone with the man in the charcoal suit. He adjusted his cap, the damp wool heavy against his forehead. He looked at his watch. The hands were crawling toward an hour he didn't like. He didn't know why he felt it, but the neatness of the man on the ground felt like a threat, a polite, well-dressed threat that was just the beginning of a long, dark conversation Port Gray wasn't ready to have. He clicked off the flashlight to save the battery, and for a moment the darkness and the fog were the same thing. There was only the sound of the city breathing, slow, heavy, and full of secrets it had no intention of sharing. Keeler reached for the coal box at the mouth of the alley, his fingers feeling like a bundle of wet sausages. He unlocked the metal door with a key that scraped in the lock like a shard of glass against a bone. The handset was cold and heavy, smelling of ozone and the stale breath of every tired beat cop who'd ever stood here wishing he were somewhere else.
This is Keeler, badge 442.
Drunk or dead, Keeler?
Dead.
Copy that, ETA 20 minutes. Stay with the package.
Keeler hung up. The silence of the alley rushed back in thicker than before. He pulled a pack of Luckies from his pocket, the cellophane crinkling with a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead man. He struck a match on the brickwork. The sulfur flare illuminated his own face for a second, a roadmap of bad shifts and cheap coffee before he settled into the rhythm of the smoke. He watched the man in the suit. In the half-light, the body didn't look like a person anymore. It looked like a window display that had fallen over. There was a precision to the kill that made the back of Keeler's throat go dry. Most murders in Port Gray were messy affairs, stabbings over a debt of $5 or a blunt instrument applied with more enthusiasm than skill. This was different. This was a surgical removal. A drop of moisture fell from a rusted fire escape above, landing on the dead man's forehead. It rolled down his temple like a single crystal tear. Keeler exhaled a cloud of smoke that hung motionless in the stagnant air. He thought about the man's family, the phone call that would eventually shatter a quiet living room somewhere uptown. Then he stopped thinking about it. In this town, sympathy was a luxury that most people couldn't afford on a patrolman's salary. Far off, the first wail of a siren began to tear through the woolly darkness. A lonely, high-pitched scream that sounded like the city itself was finally losing its mind. The Port Grey morgue was a basement cavern that smelled of formaldehyde and failed ambitions. It was the kind of place where the air felt like it had been filtered through a graveyard and then chilled to the temperature of a landlord's heart. The overhead lights were long, buzzing fluorescent tubes that flickered with a rhythmic, sickening stutter, casting a blue-white glare over the stainless steel tables. Dr. Aris Thorne stood over the charcoal suit like a hungry heron. He was a man made of sharp angles and yellowed skin, with a pair of spectacles perched on a nose that looked like it had been broken in a fight over a textbook. He didn't look at Keeler. He looked at the corpse, his eyes darting with a clinical, predatory focus.
He's a specimen, isn't he, Keeler?
Thorne's gloved hands moved with a terrifying efficiency. He peeled back the expensive jacket as if he were unwrapping a gift he already knew the contents of. He didn't find a bullet hole. He didn't find a knife wound. He found a small, bruised puncture at the base of the skull, no larger than a mosquito bite.
The needle.
So he didn't fall out of a pocket in the air. He was delivered.
Special delivery.
The doctor made the first long, sighing cut. The sound was like a zipper opening in the silence of the basement. Keeler didn't flinch, but he did look away, his gaze falling on a drain in the floor where the water was swirling in a slow, dark circle.
Check his prints.
In Port Grey, Keeler, names are like shadows. They change depending on where the light is coming from, but the dead never lie. They just wait for someone to learn their language.
He went back to work, the rhythmic scraping of metal against bone filling the room. Keeler turned and walked toward the heavy steel door, the sound of his own footsteps feeling hollow and unearned. Outside, the city was still breathing, slow and heavy, but down here in the cold heart of the morgue, the conversation was only just beginning. Thorne had moved on to the internal organs, but the man's personal effects sat on a nearby stainless steel tray, looking like the contents of a broken jewelry box. Keeler walked over, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. He picked up a pair of tweezers and began to sift through the mundane debris of a life cut short. There was a gold watch heavy enough to sink a small boat stopped at a time that meant nothing now. A wallet of fine Italian leather contained $300 in crisp bills that smelled of mint and arrogance, but no driver's license, no credit cards, and no photos of a smiling wife in a floral print. This man traveled light, like a ghost who expected to be asked for a pass at the border.
Find anything that'll make my report easier, Keeler.
Nothing but a lot of money and a total lack of identity.
Keeler pulled it out with the tweezers. On it, written in a cramped, frantic hand that looked like it had been scratched out with a fingernail, was a single address, 1422 Sycamore Apt. 4C below the address was a hand-drawn symbol, a circle with a horizontal line through it, like an eye that had seen too much and decided to close for good.
1422 Sycamore.
He looked back at the man on the table. The eye symbol on the paper seemed to mark him. It was a brand, a warning, or perhaps a signature. He slipped the scrap of paper into his pocket, the movement quick and practiced. If he called this in now, the brass would descend like vultures, and the trail would be scrubbed clean before he could even get his car out of the precinct lot.
Nothing but a dead end, Doc.
Is that so funny? You usually have a better nose for the trash than that.
My nose is full of your formaldehyde, Thorne. It dulls the senses.
Keeler turned and headed for the exit. He felt the weight of the address in his pocket, a small piece of paper that felt as heavy as a tombstone. As the heavy steel door hissed shut behind him, he knew he wasn't going back to the station. He was going to Sycamore Street, and he was going alone. The Heights was a neighborhood where the houses sat back from the street like elderly relatives hiding a dark secret. Sycamore Street was lined with ancient, gnarled trees that reached over the asphalt, their bare branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. Here, the fog wasn't the thick, fishy soup of the docks. It was a refined, silver mist that smelled of wet cedar and expensive lawn feed. Keeler pulled his battered sedan to the curb half a block away from 1422. The engine gave a final, wheezing gasp and died, leaving him in a silence so profound it made his ears ache. He sat there for a moment, the glowing tip of his cigarette the only sign of life in the car. The street lamps here didn't buzz. They glowed with a soft, aristocratic amber that made the shadows under the hedges look like pools of spilled ink. He stepped out, his heels clicking against the pavement with a sharp, lonely sound. 1422 was a pre-war apartment building with a limestone facade that had the cold, judgmental look of a high court judge. The brass trimmings around the door were polished to a shine that felt like an insult to a man who spent his days in the grime of Bracken Street. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silence. There was no doorman, just a row of polished brass mailboxes and a faint scent of floor wax and old, respected dust. Keeler didn't use the elevator, he took the stairs. The carpeted runners muffled his footsteps, making him feel like a ghost haunting his own investigation. By the time he reached the 4th floor, the air felt thin and dry. Apartment 4C was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The door was heavy mahogany, the grain of the wood looking like frozen smoke. There was no sound from inside, no radio, no muffled conversation, not even the hum of a refrigerator. Keeler shifted his weight, his hand instinctively hovering near the holster beneath his coat. He didn't knock. Instead, he tried the knob. It turned with a smooth, silent click that felt like a trap springing shut. The door drifted open an inch, revealing a sliver of darkness that smelled of something Keeler recognized instantly, a scent that didn't belong in the Heights. It was the smell of ozone, scorched silk, and the metallic tang of a struggle that had ended quickly. He pushed the door wider, his flashlight staying dark in his pocket. He didn't need it. The moonlight was filtering through a massive floor-to-ceiling window at the far end of the room, casting a silver rectangle across a floor strewn with torn papers and overturned furniture. In the center of the silver light sat a woman. She was perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, her back to him, her hair a pale waterfall of platinum that seemed to soak up the moon. She didn't turn around. She just sat there, as still as a statue in a park after the gates have been locked.
"You're late, officer."
Keeler didn't move. He stayed in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the silver and ink shadows of the room. The woman on the velvet chair was the kind of trouble that didn't just knock on your door. It moved in, rearranged the furniture, and sent you the bill for the funeral. She turned slowly, and the moonlight caught her face like a spotlight hitting a stage. She was breathtaking in the way a car crash is breathtaking, all jagged edges and high-velocity impact. Her skin was the color of cream in a dark room, and her eyes were a deep, predatory green that looked like they had seen the bottom of a lot of expensive glasses and liked what they found there. She wore a black silk robe that clung to her curves like a second, more dangerous skin, cinched at a waist so narrow it looked like a man could snap it with one hand or worship it with two.
I'm a cop, lady. We're always late. It's part of the charm.
She crossed her legs and the silk slid back to reveal a length of pale, lethal-looking thigh. She held a long, slim cigarette between two fingers that were tipped with nails the color of fresh arterial spray. She didn't look scared. She looked bored, the way a cat looks at a mouse that's already been cornered.
"You don't look like a cop."
I found a friend of yours tonight.
"Friends are a luxury I can't afford, officer. They're like cheap stockings. They always run when things get snagged."
He had a piece of paper in his pocket.
At the mention of the symbol, the boredom in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp hunger. She stood up, the silk robe whispering against her legs as she moved toward him. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, each step a calculated risk. When she stopped, she was close enough for him to smell her, a mix of jasmine, expensive tobacco, and a faint, electric scent of panic.
"That isn't a drawing, officer. Now, are you going to arrest me? Or are you going to ask me for a drink while we wait for the men who killed him to come through that door?"
Keeler looked at her, then at the door, then back to the green-eyed peril standing in his personal space. He knew he should be reaching for the steel bracelets, but his throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper, and the bottle of bourbon sitting on the sideboard looked like the only friend he had left in the world.
I take mine neat.
She smiled, a slow, predatory curving of the lips that didn't reach her eyes, and glided toward the sideboard. She poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass that looked like it had been carved from a single diamond. As she handed it to him, her fingers brushed his, a brief electric contact that felt like a short circuit in a lightning storm. Keeler drained half the glass in one go. It hit his stomach like a hot coal. He pulled his service revolver, a Smith & Wesson that had seen more disappointment than a divorce court, and checked the cylinder. Then he kicked a stray, overturned chair upright and sat down facing the door.
"The name is Vivian."
They waited. The minutes stretched out, long and thin like pulled taffy. The silence in the apartment was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic asterisk tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway that sounded like a giant's heartbeat. Outside, the fog pressed against the floor-to-ceiling window, a gray, faceless spectator watching the play. Keeler kept his eyes on the mahogany door. He expected the wood to splinter, a hail of lead to tear through the silence, or at the very least, a heavy-footed goon with a grudge to rattle the knob. But the door remained as stoic as a tombstone. 1 hour bled into 2. The tension in Keeler's shoulders began to turn into a dull ache. He watched Vivian through the haze of smoke. She hadn't moved a muscle, her eyes fixed on the shadows in the corner as if she were reading a book written in the dark.
Your invited guests must have missed the bus.
Or they've already arrived.
Keeler stood up, his knees popping like a small caliber pistol. He walked to the window and looked down at the street. His sedan was a lonely hunk of metal under the amber glow of the street lamp. The sidewalk was empty. No black sedans, no shadows huddled in doorways, no muffled footsteps on the pavement. The city had gone quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt more dangerous than a gunfight. The killers hadn't arrived, and in Port Grey, that usually meant they were already behind you. Keeler didn't like the silence. It was too thick, like a coat of paint that hadn't dried yet. He set the crystal glass down on a side table, the sharp asterisk clink asterisk sounding like a gunshot in the dead air of the apartment. Vivian watched him, her eyes tracking his movements with the stillness of a hawk on a branch.
They aren't coming.
He stopped near a heavy mahogany bookshelf. Something was off. In a room where the furniture had been tossed around like a salad, the books remained in perfect alphabetical order. It was too neat, a little island of sanity in a sea of chaos. He ran a gloved hand along the shelf, feeling for a seam, a catch, or a hollow space. Instead, his fingers brushed against a small, cold protrusion behind a leather-bound volume of Tennyson. He pulled the book back. Tucked into the woodwork was a small, circular device with a mesh face and a tiny, pulsing red light.
Is this the eye you were talking about, Vivian?
I've never seen that before.
Keeler pried the device loose with the tip of his pocket knife. It was a high-end recording unit, the kind the department talked about but could never afford. He expected to hear the low murmur of a conspiracy or the cold instructions of a hitman. He pressed the playback button on the side. There was a hiss of static, then the sound of a woman's voice. It wasn't Vivian's, it was younger, more frightened, and it was backed by the rhythmic mechanical wheeze of an iron lung.
Day 42.
The recording cut off with a sharp, electronic pop. Keeler looked at the device in his palm, then at Vivian. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. This wasn't a hit on a mobster or a play for territory. The man in the charcoal suit hadn't been killed for what he knew. He had been a donor in a city that had found a way to harvest more than just taxes from its citizens.
That wasn't about the murder.
Vivian stood up, her face losing its porcelain composure. For the first time, she looked truly terrified, not of gunmen, but of the realization that she was living in a slaughterhouse with velvet curtains.
That voice.
The New Vision Clinic was a tall, skeletal finger of concrete and glass that poked into the smog of the West Side. It was a place where the rich went to buy a few more years of breathing and the poor went to disappear. Keeler pulled his sedan into the shadow of a cooling tower, the engine giving a final metallic shudder as he cut the ignition. The air here tasted of ozone and antiseptic, a sterile, heartless smell that made the grime of the docks feel like a warm memory. He stepped into the lobby. It was as quiet as a church for a guard that didn't take requests. The floors were white marble, polished so bright they hurt the eyes, and the silence was deep enough to drown in. Behind a desk of frosted glass sat a nurse who looked like she'd been carved out of a block of salt, pale, stiff, and likely to crumble if you spoke too loud.
Can I help you, officer?
I'm looking for a girl, someone who came here for a cure and forgot to leave. She talks to recorders in the dark.
We don't have anyone by that description. This is a private facility. Unless you have a warrant, you're just a man in a wet coat wasting my time.
Keeler spent the next 3 hours prowling the hallways like a wolf in a laboratory. He found the room from the recording, a sterile white box with an iron lung that sat empty, its mechanical lungs silent and mocking. He found files filled with names of people who didn't exist and medical charts that read like a recipe book for a cannibal's feast. It was a factory of misery, a high-tech butcher shop where the New Vision was just a fancy name for the wealthy stealing the breath from the lungs of the desperate. By the time he stepped back out into the grey dawn of Port Grey, his soul felt like it had been put through a gristle mill. He had uncovered a horror that would keep the city's nightmares fueled for a decade, a systemic rot that went deeper than any street corner hustle. He had found Vivian's sister, or what was left of her, a name on a disposed list in a basement furnace. But as he sat in his car, watching the sun struggle to break through the industrial haze, he looked at the case file on his dashboard, the man in the charcoal suit, the donor. He still didn't know who had pushed the needle into the base of the man's skull. He didn't know who had carried him to that alley with geometric precision, or why he had been left there like a window display. The New Vision Clinic was a monster, but it was a monster that paid its bills and kept its hands clean. They didn't dump their waste in alleys, they burned it. The murder of the man in the charcoal suit remained a jagged, unfinished sentence in a book that had been slammed shut. There were no more clues, no more leads, just a dead man who was too clean for the world and a city that was too dirty to care. Keeler started the engine. The mystery of the alley didn't have an ending, it just had a shadow. In Port Grey, some stories don't get solved, they just get covered by the next layer of fog. He drove away from the clinic, leaving the dead to bury their dead, while the city's breath, heavy, slow, and full of secrets, continued to mark the tiny yellow circle of his life. The blue note was a hole in the wall on the edge of the fourth ward that looked like it had been carved out of a block of solid gloom. The air inside was a thick, stagnant soup of stale beer, cheap cigars, and the kind of heavy-hearted silence you only find in places where hope goes to die a quiet death. The neon sign in the window hummed like a trapped insect, casting a flickering, rhythmic pink glow over the faces of the regulars who sat at the bar like gargoyles on a cathedral of regret. Keeler pushed through the door, the bell above it giving a tired, tinny clink. He didn't stop to look around. He moved straight for the far end of the bar, a dark corner where the shadows were thick enough to hide a guilty conscience. He sat down on a stool that groaned under his weight, the leather cracked and scarred like the face of an old prize fighter.
The usual, Bernie.
Double.
Max set a glass down and poured a river of amber liquid that caught the faint, sickly light of the neon. Keeler didn't wait. He tossed it back, the burn of the rye hitting his throat like a hot poker. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids was worse. It was filled with the rhythmic wheeze of that iron lung and the waxy, too peaceful face of the man in the charcoal suit. The new vision was a horror he could put a name to, a nightmare of sterile halls and stolen breath. But the man in the alley, that was a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. No motive, no prints, no witnesses, just a perfectly dressed corpse and a silver matchbook that led to a dead end draped in silk. He looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar, a tired man in a damp coat, his eyes two hollow craters in a face that had seen too much. He was a cop in a city where the law was just a suggestion and justice was a commodity bought and sold in backrooms. A woman in a moth-eaten fur coat at the other end of the bar started to laugh, a jagged, hysterical sound that ended in a wet cough. Keeler didn't look up. He just poured himself another double. The murder in the alley was a hole in the world that nothing would fill, a jagged piece of a puzzle that didn't belong to any picture he knew.
To the ones we can't save.
He drank, the rye was cold, the room was dark, and outside the fog was already beginning to claim the streets again. The case was cold, the trail was dead, and Port Grey was moving on, its heartbeat slow and heavy, indifferent to the secrets buried beneath its skin.